10 years after the financial crisis, the inherent instability of financial markets has been further confirmed by the coronavirus pandemic, while fragilities in wider economic systems have been exacerbated, from precarious work to the consequences of high levels of debt in the global south and across the corporate sector. In this episode, we explore fragilities in financial and wider economic systems. To do so, I'm joined by Nate Hagens, who has written and spoken widely on many of these issues. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota in the USA and is co-founder and director of the organization energyandourfuture.org. Nate, welcome.
Hi, great to be here, Laurie.
Let's kick off with a quite large, expansive question. The coronavirus pandemic comes off the back of over 10 years in which we have seen how financial systems in particular and wider economic systems are beset by certain instabilities. Could you give us an idea of the kind of fragilities that we should be particularly aware of across these systems and what they mean for efforts to try and make a more sustainable world?
Yeah, the coronavirus didn't cause these problems, but it triggered many of the things that have been building over time. I think right now we're in an existential moment for societies in advanced economies. We have massive amounts of poverty, and though the stock markets are quite high right now, that is a product of the crisis, not a green light that we're going to have some V-shaped recovery. Because what's happened is the stimulus from the government and the Federal Reserve in aggregate has been a fire hose approach that they put towards the economy that has been larger than the economic damage to the economy. But it all expires at the end of July, pretty much. So they're going to have to redo more fire hose. So right now, this implies so many different things for the issues that we care about. And in my opinion, we are in this series of higher and higher hurdles, and we have to solve them sequentially. There are 100 million loans that have been deferred in the United States, and there's 50 million people, mostly in the middle class, who are getting these $600 weekly unemployment checks. That is nowhere near what their previous income were. So we have to solve the economic and poverty crisis first. Otherwise, we don't have a stable playing board to do longer term things like a carbon tax or universal basic income or ecological restoration. We have to kick the can wisely and not kick the bucket in the process.
So could you go into a bit more detail about that stable foundation that we need to have created upon which we can start to, as you say, engage in things like an ecological transformation? And I'm assuming that that the elements of that foundation are ones that cut through many countries, not just the USA as well.
Right. Well, in Europe, it's the same thing. We need to stabilize society to the effect that institutions still work, that governance still works, that there's trust in our financial architecture, that there is science. A lot of the populist revolts in the United States right now are based on kind of this normative theory that everyone has their own objective view of the world, and there is no actual truth. So we need to have actual social discourse between the left and the right that results in reason and science and policy. And right now there's so many things that are just on a precipice. And you know, this doesn't even really get into the longer term financial and energy risks. My opinion is, and I can speak to the United States, we have $26 trillion in debt. We're never going to pay that back. We don't have the energy and materials to pay that back. So, but now what we're faced with is we're going to have to issue another 10 trillion or something like that in order to feed people, keep small businesses afloat, and support the people that, you know, the broad swaths of hospitality, restaurants, retail, travel that are never coming back, even if we do get a vaccine or something like that. So I think the near-term focus, and for the people in our tribe working to make a sustainable future, this dramatically changes the choreography. We have to know that as a society, we're going to kick every can that we can possibly kick until the road is full of cans. And if you anticipate that moment, it just changes how we look at sustainability. In my opinion, we are never going to vote on climate change to keep carbon in the ground or things like that. We could do it indirectly if we navigate all this in the near term. We could develop a cultural aspiration away from GDP, corporate profits, quarterly earnings, towards measuring people's well-being. And if people's well-being, you know, what we care about is basic needs, our social relationships, and nature. If we can construct a well-being matrix around those things, on how people are really experiencing their lives, it will turn out that we don't need as much energy and stuff and indirectly emissions to have that. But all these things, and this is my big, concern, is we have this list of how the world should be. Well, let's do this, and it's going to be much more desirable and sustainable. We don't have the social and political wherewithal to get there. We have to stabilize the system first, and then that gives us a chance at this longer term emergence where these ideas that our group is working on have a chance at germinating.
And looking forward to the next couple of decades, say, in a world in which the consequences of climate breakdown and other environmental problems start to rise, what are the big fragilities in financial and wider economic systems that you think will become particularly important? So we hear often from central bankers the risks increasingly of a failure to make the transition in fossil fuel industries or investments in there, as well as the increasing downside impacts coming from environmental shocks. I guess that would be one area. Are there others or that you are thinking about in particular?
There's so many, it's impossible to fit into such a short call. One thing I would say is that the superorganism, which is global industrialized society, took a mortal blow in February 2020. I do not think we'll ever get back. Peak oil is now in the past, and I think there's a reasonable chance that 2019 will be the high level of GDP and therefore emissions. And so that changes the choreography, a lot of this stuff. As far as central banks, we are in part of a giant musical chair game. And most people don't think about it this way, but the Federal Reserve has 38 billion in capital, but they have 7 trillion in things that they've bought on their balance sheet. It's an unbelievably leveraged hedge fund, basically. And the central banks in Europe are little different, let alone Japan and China. So the risk is that we've grown our debt more than we've grown our GDP every single year since I was born. And we take it for granted like a fish swims in water, but we have consumed beyond our means for 2 generations. And a lot of that we've used debt to pull consumption forward, and that bill is coming due now. And we have to stabilize that situation first. Otherwise, we can't get back to the stability and discourse that we have today. So I'm actually very worried on that, and I've dropped everything to work on making sure that governments support businesses and individuals through the next 6 months until we get through the worst of the medical side of the virus.
And do you think that when it comes to those decision makers who are actively working on this at the moment, those politicians who you may be speaking to and working with, how much are they starting to put considerations of resilience at the forefront of their mind? And in general, do you think people are starting to see the coronavirus pandemic not as one particular shock that's come out of the blue, but more they had a shift in how they approach the world and see that risk is inherent in a lot of our systems?
I don't know about politicians. Politicians are riding high on the superorganism. They're just trying to get stuff to their constituents who are hurting. The people I talk to in my network, maybe someone made $100,000 last year and had to drive 45 minutes to Denver and back every day. And now they're only making $90,000 a year, but they're working from home and they have more time with their dogs and their kids and the forest. And so I think culturally, this pandemic has allowed us to ask questions about what's it all for and how do I make my own life better and how am I happy? I think on the political front, the resilience questions are pretty far down the pipe. They're just looking at what do we do now to help people. And which is why ecologically, climate change and the sixth mass extinction are by far the largest risk we face, Laurie, being alive as humans at this time. But behaviorally, emotionally, politically, they're going to be pretty far down the list. I've talked to 20 politicians in the last 2 weeks. The word climate change was never mentioned, and most of them were leftward-leaning politicians. Economy is going to be the focus, and poverty for the foreseeable future. And we have to creatively think 2 or 3 steps ahead on how to, if we're going to support via debt and other things, we have to think about how to do that with ecological restoration locally or different things. The problem is we got to do this now, and there's no infrastructure. We're not an equalite society that thinks with intelligent foresight down the road. So it's politically very difficult to accomplish these things. And I think education and inspiration about the specialness of our time, and that not everything is fully broken, and that we need to roll up our sleeves and collaborate with people. This is where we're at right now. And one final thing, you know, we tend to talk to people only in our own group that care about ecology and the oceans and climate. And we have to realize that there's a whole nother group that doesn't even speak our language. And I think the real hope is to find a different way of living with each other and the planet that 60, 70, 80% of people could agree with. Because otherwise it's just this pendulum that swings left and right and nothing ever gets accomplished. So that's kind of my thinking there.
Fantastic. Nate, we have run out of time, as always, too little. But thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Laurie.
Thank you very much.